I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to the next segment of our conference, The National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. This is actually the heart of our conference. We're now going into the autopsy that the U.S. National Security Establishment conducted on the body of President Kennedy. And we're honored and pleased to have a distinguished speaker tonight, Douglas Horne. Doug served on the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s as chief analyst for military records. He's the author of the Watershed book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. That book actually served as an inspiration for my book called The Kennedy Autopsy, which remains the all-time bestseller in the Future of Freedom Foundation. And then the subsequent sequel, The Kennedy Autopsy 2. The way we're going to work it tonight is, I'm sure all of you know, or at least most of you know, the presentation that Doug was going to give tonight, he actually pre-recorded. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes. I think you'll find that it is an absolutely excellent presentation of the medical evidence relating to the autopsy. We posted that online about 10 days ago, and we invited people to watch it in advance. And so we reserved tonight for Q&A. And it's going to be mostly Q&A, but with a couple of exceptions. First of all, when I turn things over to Doug, he's going to make a couple of brief observations or insights. And then we've got a bonus for you, a free bonus for everybody participating in this conference. Doug, as I'm sure some of you are aware, one of the autopsy physicians, pathologist, Commander Humes, the evidence showed that he actually burned his notes and an autopsy report, destroyed evidence in the autopsy of a president of the United States. And so Doug has prepared a recorded talk that explains what was going on there relating to the evolving nature of the autopsy reports. So what we're going to do tonight, once I turn it over to Doug, he's going to make a couple of observations. Then we're going to have Q&A for a little over an hour. Then we're going to watch that video. It's about an hour long. And then after the video, we conclude with more Q&A. So I also should mention that the chat feature is turned off. Doug asked us to do that so that it wouldn't serve as a distraction to him during the Q&A. And we've honored that request. And so without any further ado, Doug, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you. Thank you for the excellent presentation, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and thanks to the FFF. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to begin by correcting one irritating mistake I made in my long presentation that's already online. It's impossible to speak for 2 hours and 42 minutes without making a boo-boo of some kind. Try it sometime if you don't think so. So at one point I was discussing a short speech Lyndon Johnson made on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base after Air Force One had landed on November 22nd, 1963. And I intended to say that Lyndon Johnson spoke briefly for only 45 seconds because I timed it with a stopwatch. And it came out, Lyndon Johnson spoke for 45 minutes. So I apologize for that error. I assume that from the context of the timeline I was discussing on that slide, that probably 98% of you understand I just misspoke, but he only spoke for 45 seconds, not 45 minutes. Now, before we begin the Q&A tonight, I would like to put up 3 images briefly and talk about them. And then I'll turn off my screen sharing, and then we'll get right into the Q&A. So bear with me while I try to put these images up. Let's see what I've learned about Zoom here. Okay, screen sharing. Okay, let's go and see if it works. Okay, can you all see that image, Jacob?
Yep, it
Very
worked.
good. This is an image prepared by Dr. David Mantic. I want to give him all credit for this. And it illustrates very simply the concept that he and I share, which is that there were 3 headshots that killed President Kennedy. These are the locations of the entry wounds on the skull as David Mantic and I see it. I first wrote about this in my book in 2009. And when he wrote his book about the JFK head wounds, he ended up endorsing this 3 headshot scenario. So I'm grateful to him for producing this diagram some years back. So the yellow arrow low in the back of the head is 1 entry wound. Low in the back of the head, slightly above the EOP, the bump in the back of your head, and just to the right of it. 2 more entry wounds are found on the front and the right front of the head. The red arrow depicts an entry wound high above the right eye, high in the forehead, directly above the corner of the right eye, high in the forehead. And the green arrow depicts another wound in the skull, which David and I believe is an entry wound. And I believe Dr. Chesser is about 85% persuaded that it's an entry wound. He'll talk about that next week, but in the right temple. So the wound in the right temple depicted by the green arrow would be hidden in the hair, which is why it wasn't seen at Parkland Hospital. It's just above and just forward of the right ear, inside the hairline. And the entry wound high in the forehead above the right eye would have been hidden by the president's long bangs in front, which is why they didn't see that either. So this is these are the 3 entry wounds that I subscribe to. I believe Dr. Mantic still agrees with this. And this is a diagram explaining that complicated slide that was in my presentation, which had a lot of words in it, but it's much easier to understand, I think, when we look at the diagram. Now, let me go on to the next one. Next image I want to share. Okay. Everybody see this, Jacob?
Yep.
Very good. This is a diagram. Let me show you the title of it. It's an illustration from my book. This is a diagram made by former Navy photographer's mate, Sandra Spencer. She was an E6 Navy photographer's mate in charge of the White House photo lab at the Naval Photographic Center at Anacostia, in Southeast Washington, D.C. And she developed color negatives and color prints of postmortem images of the president the weekend after he died, probably on Sunday, to her best recollection. Now, she recalls for the review board, we took her deposition, her sworn testimony under oath. She recalled to us that one of the photographs that she developed the negative, the color negative, and then developed a print, then did color correction, and then made one good test print of each color negative. Showed what she called a chunk of the president's skull blown out the back of his head. This image was not in my presentation because of image formatting problems that I had. This is a PDF image, and you cannot put a PDF image into a PowerPoint. So this is what she recalled seeing in the photograph she developed of the back of JFK's head. Now, the important thing about this image is that her set of photographs is not in the official collection today and never was in the official collection. And she also recalled that President Kennedy, in the photograph she developed, was very cleaned up. There was no blood visible. There was no gore, as she put it. There were no open body cavities. And the photographs were very respectful. You could see no one in the background, no one wearing scrubs, no one's hands on the president holding him up or anything else. And so this is the most remarkable of the pictures she recalled. And the important thing about it is that it was her impression after looking at the official autopsy photo collection that the pictures she developed must have been taken after embalming was completed, after the restoration of the body, the reconstruction of the body, and the embalming had been completed, because the president was very cleaned up in her images, no open body cavities, no blood. So my point is that if she saw a chunk about 2 to 2.5 inches wide missing from the occipital region of the back of President Kennedy's head in her photographs after embalming was completed, then you know for a fact there's something wrong with the photographs of the back of JFK's head in the official collection that show it to apparently be intact. There's something wrong with those photographs based on this. And our general counsel for the review board, Jeremy Gunn, my boss, thought that Sandra Spencer was the most credible witness that we deposed in the medical evidence arena. We took 10 depositions of people involved in or participating in the autopsy. She was one of the 10. He thought she was the most credible witness. She also recalled a photograph of the president lying down with a complete brain, an intact brain next to him, next to his body. And we asked her if the brain was damaged, and she said, no, it didn't appear to be damaged at all. But there it was on display next to the body. So, of course, there's a mystery behind her story. We don't know why the photographs were made, or at whose orders, they were not included in the collection, in the archives. But this was her most significant recollection right here. I wanted to share that with everybody. There's one more thing I'd like to share before we start the Q&A. And this is, let's see, this is what I think it is. No, okay, let's get rid of this. There we go. Now, I talked a lot about the 3 casket entries in my talk online. And the one document I didn't show you in that PowerPoint was the report of the military casket team, the Joint Service Casket Bearer Team, or the Honor Guard, some people call it. So Lieutenant Byrd wrote a report after the events of that weekend were over, and I'm going to use my cursor here to emphasize the black arrow. This is the time of the 3rd casket entry. You'll see that it reads, from ambulance to the morgue at 2000 hours, 22 November. 2000 hours is military time for 8:00 p.m. So this is the one supporting document that I was not able to include in my presentation, and I thought everybody should see that. So that's it for now. I might have a couple of more to share later. But Jacob, I'm ready for the Q&A.
Okay, great. Let's start with a question from Beverly that says, viewing the graphic photo showing the massive damage to the top and right of JFK's head, could you expound on the fact that Nurse Bell, in her taped interviews, made a point of saying that she had to ask, where's the wound? The insinuation being that that horrible wound is not what she observed at Parkland.
That's a good question. Jeremy and I went to Texas in 1997, and we interviewed 3 people who had been missed by the Warren Commission. We weren't allowed to reinvestigate formally, but we were allowed to clarify the record. And we thought by interviewing 3 people the Warren Commission missed, that we could help clarify the record. So one of those people was Audrey Bell. She was the head operating room nurse at Parkland Hospital. And as you will recall, I showed you her wound diagram in the presentation that's online, the one you've already viewed. And her wound diagram shows what she believed to be an exit wound in the right rear of the president's head in the occipital region. Now, during this interview at her home, she told us that she asked Dr. Perry, who is the in charge of the treatment team at Parkland. He was administering closed chest massage, pushing down on the president's chest with the heels of his hands to try to circulate his blood a little bit. she asked Dr. Perry, "Where's the wound?" And when she said, "Where's the wound?" what she meant was she couldn't see any damage to the top of the president's head or to the side of the president's head. So she said, "Dr. Perry," without speaking, I'll mimic what he did. He put his hand on the right side of the president's jaw and rotated his head like this, just to the side. The president's lying supine, and he moved his head like this so that she could see this exit wound in the posterior skull, in the right rear of the skull. And that's, she said, that's the only way she could see the wound. So after she made these statements, of course, I asked her the obvious question: did you see any damage to the top of the president's head or to the right side of the president's head? And she said, no. And she kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And she looked at me and looked at Jeremy, and she said, no. That's why I had to ask Dr. Perry, where is the wound? So the same thing happened with Dr. Crenshaw. We asked Dr. Crenshaw, did you see any damage to the top of the president's head or to the right side of his head? And he said, no. And he was just as adamant about that as she was. So one can only conclude from this that I'm correct, that all of this massive damage to the top of the president's head and the right side, the missing bone to the top of his head especially, is the result of manipulations performed at Parkland before the autopsy started, postmortem surgery, just to get access to the brain and remove bullet fragments from the brain.
You said Parkland. I think you meant Bethesda.
I'm sorry if I just misspoke. The autopsies at Bethesda, the treatments at Parkland. Does that help clarify?
Oh, I thought you were talking about the manipulation that was done.
Well, yeah, the manipulation of his body, the postmortem surgery, was at Bethesda. So if I said otherwise, I misspoke. So
okay.
Audrey Bell was at Parkland. She was in the trauma room 1 for about 5 minutes before she had to leave and go take care of Governor Connally's wounds when he was placed into surgery. But she did have 5 minutes to observe. And the only way she was able to see President Kennedy's occipital wound was that Dr. Perry put his fingers on the president's jaw and turned his head to the anatomical left so that she could see the wound. She did not see wound that any damage at Parkland to the top or the right side of his head. And that's significant.
Okay. Philip asked, did Leland Benson provide any report for the November 25th, 63 processing of the brain tissue? Did he discuss the sectioning of the brain that was done at that brain exam?
Okay, that's a good question. Leland Benson was I believe they called him a histopathology technician. He dealt with pathological analysis of body tissue. And the House Select Committee interviewed him in either 77 or 78. And he told their staff that he processed brain tissue on November 25th, 1963, and that he assumed it was the president's. No one else was working that day. It was the day of the funeral and everyone had a national holiday. And so all I can tell you is that he was not present at the brain exam conducted that day by Humes and Boswell with Stringer photographing it. He processed the tissue that was given to him. If he wrote a report, we don't have it today. I will defer to what he told the House Select Committee. I can't remember whether he told them he wrote a report or not. He must have written a report that he would have given to the chief pathologist, Dr. Humes. I mean, he must have written a report. But the House Select Committee wasn't able to obtain one, and we weren't able to obtain one either. We couldn't locate him.
Okay. Alfred asks, Mr. Horn, you put a lot of stock in the Boyajian report. What gives you such confidence that the report is legitimate and that the casket arrival time therein is accurate?
I put a lot of stock in it. That's right. Two primary reasons. We were given a lead by a researcher, a colleague of Gary Aguilar's, as a matter of fact, a nurse named Kathy Cunningham. She had already interviewed him herself. She contacted the review board and notified us that, hey, the guy that was in charge of the Marine security detail wrote a report back in 1963, and you should contact him and get a hold of it. So we did. I talked to him on the phone. He confirmed that those are the duties he had that night. He was from the Marine barracks in Washington, D.C. He was the non-commissioned officer in charge of the Marine security detail at Bethesda. He reported to Admiral Galloway, the head of the complex, when he got there with his men, and they provided physical security during the autopsy. He told me on the phone that it was true that he had written a report. He had one of the onion skin carbon copies made in 1963. You know, in those days, you type an original and you have several sheets of carbon paper, and the copies are made on onion skin. So he was allowed to keep an onion skin copy. Now, of course, onion skin copies aren't signed. The only thing signed in those days was the original. But that doesn't mean anything to me. I know what the procedures were in those days. So the important thing to me is that he confirmed that that was his role. Those were his duties. He authenticated this report on the phone, said he didn't remember much about the event anymore, but he confirmed that he wrote the report, he did the duties described in the report, and he mailed it to the review board with an authenticating letter, which he signed, saying, this is the report I wrote. So that's one reason I have a lot of faith in his report. The other reason I have a lot of faith in his report is it's consistent with the oral recollections of Dennis David, starting in 1975. Now, Dennis David was an E6 Navy corpsman who was filling the billet of chief of the day. He wasn't a Navy chief, but he was filling the billet of chief of the day on November 22nd, 63. And Dennis David first spoke publicly to a newspaper reporter about what he recalled in 1975. So he recalled the arrival of a black hearse and a shipping casket. He and his sailors took the shipping casket from the vehicle to the anteroom outside the morgue, set it down, and were told to leave, to depart. So he departed, and he went on his rounds and ended up sometime between 15 and 30 minutes later in the front of the hospital, looking out the window as the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base arrived out in front of the hospital. Now, the sequence was always clear in his mind that he and his working party offloaded the shipping casket first, and that it was much later. Most of the time he would tell this story, he would say 20 or 30 minutes later that he was in the front of the hospital and witnessed the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base drive up. Most of the time when he made an estimate of what time he thought he had taken the shipping casket to the morgue anteroom, he would estimate maybe 6:40 p.m. at the latest, 6:45, but probably about 6:40. So, you know, he's interviewed by David Lifton several times after he's interviewed by the newspaper. And later in other venues, he's interviewed on film. So when we get the Boyajian report in 1997, and he provides a time of 1835 military time, which is 6:35 p.m., to me, that pins a precise time on the Dennis David recollection of when the shipping casket arrived. And so Boyajian corroborates Dennis David in my mind, and Dennis David corroborates Boyajian. It's a two-way mutual confirmation. So that's my answer.
Okay. Adam says, during the official autopsy, there was a gallery who observed JFK's brain seemingly fall out of the cranium without the sawing and cutting required for such a procedure. Wouldn't this have appeared bizarre? Didn't anyone question this at the time?
I don't know if everyone in the gallery saw that or not. There were possibly as many as 35 people in the gallery. But you got to understand there are at that point in time, between 8:15 and 8:30, before Dr. Fink arrived, there are two physicians standing around the president. That's Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell. James Jenkins, the Navy corpsman assisting Dr. Humes, is also standing by the body. And there are many other people in the morgue. Paul O'Connor would have been standing somewhere, presumably, and many other people. Now, you'll recall from my presentation that it's James Jenkins, whose job it normally was to remove the brain, is the source of the recollection that Dr. Humes said, quote, "This brain has fallen out in my hands," unquote. So that's one of his most vivid recollections of that night, perhaps the most vivid recollection, after which Dr. Humes hands him the brain, and Jenkins puts what's left of the brain upside down in a bucket half full of formaldehyde, and starts to infuse the brain with injection drip. And when he's finally finished with the injection drip, then the brain is soaked in the bucket for 2.5 days of formaldehyde. Now, as far as the question goes, how many people in the gallery actually saw that happen? I don't know the answer to that. There are countless things about JFK's death and the autopsy that we will never know. But all I can tell you is that James Jenkins has been telling about this recollection of his for years, and talked about it in public, I think for the first time in 2013 at a Dallas conference at the Adolphus Hotel. And he met twice that evening with groups of researchers. They were like breakout sessions. So he was not on a big stage and there weren't cameras rolling, but Dr. Mantic took very careful notes. And I used those notes to write a report on my blog back in 2013. And I used Mantic's notes to compose those 4 slides in my presentation. So James Jenkins, to me, is as honest as the day is long. He's completely trustworthy and reliable. So I believe what he said. One of his recollections was that as he turned the brain upside down, was that the brain stem had been severed by 2 scalpel cuts in different planes. So one scalpel cut on one side, one scalpel cut on the other side, and that it was not torn. In other words, it wasn't torn from the spinal cord by a bullet. It had been severed and in 2 different planes, one on each side. So his conclusion, as he told his audience in Dallas in 2013, was that the brain had been removed previously. Dr. Humes didn't have to cut the optic nerves or any of the other structures that connect the bottom of the brain to the bottom of the cranium. And he certainly didn't have to cut the spinal cord. So his conclusion was that it had been done earlier. My conclusion from hearing him say that is it was done earlier that evening, about an hour and 15 minutes earlier, something like that.
Okay, Tim, did you have something else?
No,
Okay.
that's about all I can say. I can't tell you what every person in the gallery saw or didn't see.
Right. Okay, Tim asked, how do the wounds that Connally received line up with what we now know about the Kennedy medical evidence and how it doesn't fit with a magic bullet?
Well, it doesn't seem to fit at all. Dr. Michael Bodden was the head of the House Select Committee's forensic pathology panel. And I've seen him say this on television, so I'm not quoting hearsay here. I'm quoting what came out of his mouth. They concluded that the angle from the entrance wound in the president's back to the tracheotomy site in the throat was an 11-degree upward angle, upward. Now, he tried to make the single bullet theory work by saying on television, well, the angle from the entrance wound in the back to the trach site in the throat was an 11-degree upward angle. So he said, this is what he did on television in 1988. The president would have had to been leaning very far forward for the bullet to go in his back and come out the front of his throat and hit the governor. That's what he said. At which point I started laughing in 1988 because the Zapruder film shows the president wasn't leaning forward at that point. He's sitting straight up and down. So first of all, I don't believe any bullet transited from the president's back out the front of his throat. That's nonsense. That was an invention put in the final version of the autopsy report. But even if it had, it could not have hit Governor Connally below the right armpit, because that's where his entrance wound was, and his back was below the right armpit. So, you got to realize Governor Connolly's sitting in a jump seat, which is very low on the floor of the car. It's lower than JFK's seat bench. And so therefore nothing lines up. And that's my answer to your question.
Okay. Mark says, when, where, how, and by whom was JFK's body transferred from the heavy ornate funeral home casket to the lightweight shipping casket in which it arrived at Bethesda for the autopsy?
Okay. As I discussed in my presentation, David Lifton did the best work that's been done on the 3 casket entries and on events in and around Air Force One at Love Field. So he not only wrote about a luggage transfer between the 2 airplanes, which nobody understood since Air Force Two was going to fly back to Andrews also, but he talks about witnesses who saw a forklift on the starboard side of the airplane. So he has told me about that he's interviewed people that saw a forklift over there. So the casket, the Dallas casket, goes on board the airplane at 2:18. It arrives at Love Field at 2:14 p.m. Central Time. It's carried onto the plane at 2:18 p.m. Judge Hughes doesn't arrive. She did the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. She doesn't arrive until 2:30 p.m. The swearing ends at 2:38, and the plane takes off at 2:47. So there's several minutes there between the time the casket, the Dallas casket, is taken on board Air Force One at 2:18 and the time Judge Hughes arrives at 2:30. As soon as Jackie went on board the airplane, she went to the stateroom to compose herself. She needed some privacy. And the Secret Service was, as they told people, still removing some seats in the tail compartment. And then they had to strap down the Dallas casket and secure it to the deck for flight. So people were not allowed back there during that time. So that's when David Lifton infers, and I agree with his inference, that's when the body was taken out of the Dallas casket, was sometime between 2:18 Central Time and the start of the swearing in. The start of the swearing in was at 2:38. So, and a forklift, of course, would have had to have been used to take the body from the aft starboard galley door and place it in one of the two luggage compartments, the after luggage compartment or the forward luggage compartment. So there's a researcher who was at the Cyril Wecht conference. I believe it was it was either in 2013 or maybe a few years before that. Jamie Sawa, I believe his name was, he had visited Air Force One at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's on display. SAM 26,000 is on display, and he had been allowed to stand on a ladder and look into the two luggage compartments. So he gave a presentation on this and how there was room in both compartments to have laid a human body. Although he thought there was so much radio equipment in the forward luggage compartment that the aft compartment, which is right underneath the door in the tail section, might have been a better candidate because there was no radio equipment in there. It was just a long bench on which you could have laid luggage or anything. So the answer is before the swearing-in occurred and after the casket went on board at 2:18.
Okay.
Now, yeah, the end of my long answer is that once the plane took off, of course, the casket was surrounded by the Kennedy entourage, and they held an Irish wake, and nobody left the casket at that point. And of course, the casket was never opened during flight. It couldn't be opened. It was strapped down to the deck. But anyone who says they were with the casket the whole time it was on the airplane is not telling the truth. Even Godfrey McHugh, who says, I was with the casket the whole time, wasn't. He ran forward twice to ask the pilot of the airplane, why aren't you taking off? So he left the casket unattended on at least 2 occasions before the plane took off. So that's my answer.
Okay. Charlie says, are you sympathetic to or unsympathetic to the Kennedy family not releasing the JFK photos?
I'm not too sympathetic with that. I think I can understand the emotions that went into that original decision of theirs. When they were forced to give the medical materials, all the photographs, the x-rays, and the clothing back to the US government, and they gave most of the materials back on October 31st, 1966. The deed of gift was a sweetheart deal between the Kennedy family and the Justice Department. So the deed of gift said that they would have control over who would see the materials and how they would be used, whether or not they could be published, for example. And if independent researchers were going to examine them, they would decide who that would be or who it would not be. At the time, there was concern by Robert Kennedy that the president's remains not become a subject of morbid curiosity, but there has been so much time that has elapsed. And because we have 2 bootleg autopsy photo collections, one in color and one in black and white, that have been published in books. And then people like me have assured researchers that, well, they are accurate general depictions of what's in the archives, but they are cropped around the edges. Part of each image is missing around the edges because they're photographs of photographs. And there's some contrast buildup. So you can see more detail in the originals in the archives. So I think the time has long passed where I think they should permit the publication of these items and their examination by an independent panel of photographic experts. Because there are serious questions about the photos of the back of the head. And I think we need to take a new look with people who are truly independent and not biased one way or the other, and do stereoscopic imaging of those photos to determine if there's something wrong with those pictures. Because clearly they're dishonest in some way. I don't know if scalp was manipulated and moved halfway around the president's head to cover up the big hole in the back of his head, or if they're photographic forgeries. I don't know, but there's something wrong with those pictures. And so I think, yes, it's time for the Kennedy family to permit publication and to permit study by photographic experts.
Okay, what would compel, this is from Bob, what would compel the conductors of the autopsy and the medical cover-up to go along with the monstrous, gruesome tasks that they were given, and by whom? Were they just good military men following orders, no matter how wrong they knew it was? Was it the "it will be World War III if the people think Castro or Russians did it" ruse?
I think it's both. I think, first of all, most of the people, I think, who participated in cover-up actions in the assassination were not sinister members of the cabal that ordered President Kennedy killed. They were people carrying out orders. And in many cases, I think they were given excuses or reasons that helped to justify what they did in their own minds. So yes, Humes and Boswell were obviously military men following orders, but I believe they were given a World War III cover story. So, we know that Lyndon Johnson told Earl Warren, after Warren refused twice, I think, to chair the Warren Commission, that you have to do this. If you don't, we could have World War III and 40 million people could die. I think the same kind of thing was probably done with Humes and Boswell. I would expect before the body arrived, somebody got together with them. Maybe it was Rear Admiral Galloway, the head of the complex. Maybe it was Vice Admiral Kenny, the Surgeon General of the Navy. More likely, both of those men got together with Humes and Boswell and said, look, we've been told the president was killed by a crossfire in Dallas. And we know the communists did it. And we've got one of these guys under arrest now. But we can't tell the American people that the president was killed in a crossfire in Dallas by communists. Because if we do, we'll have World War III. So it's your patriotic duty to do what we're going to tell you to do, which is to sanitize the crime scene. Remove all evidence of frontal shots that you can remove. Don't discuss frontal shots during the autopsy, and only write about shots from behind when you write the autopsy report. So I believe that, yes, they were very much men who followed orders, and that they were also given a World War III scare story, and that they believed it at the time. Whether or not Humes and Boswell had doubts in later years, and whether or not they wondered if they'd been snookered, whether or not they wondered if they'd been betrayed, I don't know. If they felt they'd been deceived, then they took that to their grave with them. Because, we were hoping that one of them would confess to this ruse under oath, and they didn't. If we had been allowed to depose Dr. Boswell a second time, we might have gotten a lot more out of him. He was the most forthcoming of the three pathologists. But that's how I see it. I think they were approached before the body arrived and told what they had to do. And I know that one person, Dennis David, told a friend of mine before he died. Dennis David was the chief of the day at Bethesda. He helped carry the shipping casket from the Black Hearse to the morgue anteroom. He believed that Dr. Boswell's personality changed completely after the JFK autopsy, that he acted like a man who had been compromised and didn't want to talk to anybody, and was scared to talk about the subject, and was very sensitive about the whole business, but almost acted ashamed when people would ask him about it. So his personality certainly changed. We know from the testimony of others and from the recollections of others that we had all kinds of people giving Humes orders that night, and yet he was such an arrogant poseur that he would never admit to that. So Dr. Berkeley wrote in a report that he was telling Humes what to do, and that he was controlling the autopsy, that Berkeley was. Well, Humes didn't admit to that, even when we showed him what Berkeley had written. There were civilians in the morgue telling the doctors what to do and what not to do, men in suits. This was recalled vividly by James Jenkins and Paul O'Connor, but Humes wouldn't admit to this either. So his defense mechanism was to say, I was the one in charge. I was totally in charge. Regretfully, nobody told me what to do. I was in charge. That was his defense. And Dr. Boswell's defense was to say, I don't want to talk about this, and to clam up. So I think it was both.
Okay, Howard says, why and how is it that all of this evidence still available, and why was there any record or evidence of any of this? It seems to me that if you're trying to get away with murder, why would you keep any records or evidence of it at all?
Well, you should listen to my addendum presentation later during the Q&A, because I'll be talking about how the autopsy report evolved. There were 4 sets of conclusions. One was oral. The next 3 changes were each in writing. So your question might as well be addressed to that. Why would the government keep changing the contents of the autopsy report? And yet they did. So what you're asking is, why are there witnesses to a crime? Why are criminals ever caught? Criminals are caught because they're witnesses to what they do, or they leave clues behind. So in the case of the 3 casket entries, you have a compartmentalized operation going on. And at the time, none of the 3 sets of actors moving the 3 caskets in and out are aware of the other actions. They're not aware of what the other people saw. We only became aware of these things decades later, when independent researchers started to interview people. So we had the names of the casket team, the honor guard, David Lifton started to interview those people. And it was like amazing what he found. Dennis David started to talk in 1975 about the shipping casket and the casket entry he assisted with. Paul O'Connor and James Jenkins are important witnesses to the autopsy. Yes, they're little people, but to me, the little people don't have a reason to lie. They have no motivation to lie. And once the House Select Committee got the gag order removed, there was a military gag order on all the people in the Navy who participated in the autopsy or who were aware of key events. And everybody was forced to go before either Captain Stover or Captain Canada and sign the gag order a day or 2 after the autopsy. And they were, the threat was, you'll be subject to court-martial if you even discuss the events that occurred at the autopsy. The House Select Committee went to great efforts to get the gag order lifted, and they had to fight with the Department of Defense, but they finally got the DOD to lift the gag order. And once that happened, most of these people were willing to talk. Not all of them, but most of them. And then once they talked, others began to talk. So you can't keep all the events that took place from having witnesses, and the witnesses begin to talk. So truth is the daughter of time. That's all I can say.
Okay. Jim says, based on the alteration of the body, the way it occurred and the timing of it, is it your assessment that the body alteration was always in the planned operation? Specifically, if the day 1 cover was Cuba did it, leading to war, then having multiple shooters with wounds as is would not have mattered. However, if day 2 cover, lone nut, lone shooter from the rear, was decided by LBJ within 12 to 24 hours, then body alteration would have been necessary. What are your thoughts?
I think it's more like this. Some members of the Secret Service, it's very unpleasant to say this. We know this today. We're dirty, okay? There was security stripping of that motorcade. And it's clear that the Secret Service had orders not to allow an autopsy in Texas, to get the body back to Washington. It's very clear from their behavior at Parkland Hospital that those were their orders. So I think the plan was simply, put enough gunmen in Dealey Plaza to make sure the president is killed. You can't shoot at a head of state in the world's #1 superpower and not kill him and expect to get away with it. So you have to make sure that he's killed. So you've got gunmen all over the place in Dealey Plaza, multiple locations. You don't really know which bullets are going to do the job and which bullets are going to miss. We know there were missed shots that day from the accounts of many eyewitnesses. So I think the plan was simply to get the body away from Texas, get it to a government facility, a military facility in Washington, where the autopsy and the results of the autopsy and the reporting on it can be controlled. And the biggest part of that process was clearly to, because we have what I call a stage prop rifle and 3 planted shell casings. Those are my conclusions. You have to make sure the results of the autopsy comport with the stage props, with the stage prop rifle and the 3 shell casings, shots from above and behind. Of course, if you end up with shots fired from the front hitting the president, then of course you're going to have to remove that metal from his body and remove the evidence of frontal shots from his body. So I think it was one big contingency plan waiting to happen. And the key thing was the venue, was getting the body to Washington where the military could do the autopsy and where those people could be controlled. You notice, the government could have had renowned forensic pathologists who are civilians do the autopsy. They could have had people from New York City and Baltimore do the autopsy, but they didn't. So it's done at a military setting with mid-level military people who can be controlled by people of higher rank and who were controlled. I would think that anyone who is in charge of the impending medical cover-up would have expected, yes, that some shots from the front are probably going to hit the president, but it's something we're just going to have to put up with because we have to make sure that he's killed and that he doesn't get away and hunt us all down. So I'm sure that they expected they would probably have to remove metal from the brain and bullet tracks from brain tissue that indicated there were frontal shots. And in the case of high in the right forehead, remove an entry wound. That's all I want to say about that is
okay. Yeah.
They were prepared to be flexible.
Okay. Charlie says, is there corroboration from morticians, surgeons, et cetera, that the head reconstruction work could be accomplished in the 6:35 to 8 p.m. time frame?
There was no head reconstruction work that took place between 6:35 and 8 o'clock. This is a concept David Lifton came out with in his book. I don't support it. At the time, he believed the House committee's conclusions about the photographs and the x-rays. You have to understand this. He believed them saying that the autopsy photographs were authentic and not altered. And yet now we know there's something very wrong with photographs of the back of the head. David Mantik thinks they're photographic alterations because they just don't look right in stereoscopic viewing, according to him. But David Mantik believed that the skull x-rays were unaltered. But David Mantik has determined that they have been altered. The skull x-rays are alterations. They're altered copy films. The blowout in the right rear of the head has been covered up by light blasting. He'll be talking about that in 2 weeks. So look, I think this concept that David Lifton had was that the body was reconstructed to fool the camera and to fool the x-ray machine, and that's just not true. This was, it's rather macabre to say it this way, but it's butchery, plain and simple. Open up the president's skull, get the metal out of his brain, take some of his brain tissue out if it shows bullet tracks from frontal shots. And that's why Paul O'Connor was confused and thought there was no brain in the cranium. So much brain tissue had been removed in the forebrain and in the right hemisphere, missing in the back from exit wound in Dallas, but missing up here from postmortem surgery. So I don't believe that the head was reconstructed between 6:35 and 8 o'clock. There's no type of surgery I know of that could do that. So Dr. Boswell explained to us during his deposition, it's very important to understand this, that when the scalp flaps were closed, of course, Dr. Boswell told us a white lie. He drew the sketch of the massive damage to the top of the skull on the back of the autopsy descriptive sheet, right? And he would have us believe that that's all damage from the assassin's bullet, that all this bone is missing because of one exiting bullet. So he described a laceration which went like this all the way down the scalp. And he said that when those scalp flaps were closed, when they were closed, you couldn't see the large extent of the skull defect. So I think that's all that happened after the postmortem surgery is the scalp flaps were closed. And when the head is unwrapped again after 8 o'clock, at first, the only thing the FBI agents see is, I'm sure they saw blood up here, but they saw the same exit wound in the back of the head that had been seen in Dallas because the scalp flaps had been closed. Then when the scalp flaps are opened, shortly after that, that's when the audience in the morgue starts to react and to protest, actually, according to Paul O'Connor. That can't be damage from a bullet. That looks like surgery. So that's when Humes makes his infamous statement, there's been surgery of the head area in the top of the skull, recorded by the FBI agents. He's trying to satisfy the disturbed audience in the morgue that isn't buying it as damage by a bullet. And then apparently, according to one witness, Boswell asked a question of one of the admirals in the gallery, was there surgery in Dallas? So they're trying to snow the audience. And I don't think they were very successful, really, but there was no reconstructive surgery, as I see it, between 6:35 and 8 o'clock.
Okay. Beverly asks, in regard to the third casket entry, wasn't Godfrey McHugh present with the honor guard at 8 p.m.? Wouldn't this provide further evidence that the Dallas casket was reintroduced after the time it was brought in by FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill with Secret Service agents Greer and Kellerman?
That's a very good point. Let's remind everybody that the first time the Dallas casket entered, approximately 7:17, we don't have an exact time, but approximately 7:17, based on an internal FBI interview conducted of them, it was just those two agents and two Secret Service agents who took it in. It was Kellerman and Greer, who had been in the front of the limousine in Dallas. Seibert and O'Neill struggled and managed to get this casket out of a white ambulance onto a church truck. And then they wheeled it into the anteroom outside the morgue. Nobody assisted them. Nobody assisted them. Godfrey McHugh did not assist them. But he did assist with the Dallas casket entry, and that was the one at 8 o'clock. And we know about this for three reasons. William Manchester writes about it in his book, Death of a President, that Godfrey McHugh tried to assist with carrying the casket in with the honor guard. But he weighed more than these guys, these young guys who were the members of the casket team. And there were railings on either side of the stairways leading up to the, from the driveway to the loading dock. And he couldn't fit between the casket and the railing. He was too big. So he had to give up and let the Coast Guardsman, George Barnum, take his place again as a pallbearer. So Manchester writes about it. And Hubert Clark, one of the pallbearers in the honor guard, interviewed by David Lefton, recalled that incident. He recalled Godfrey McHugh trying to take the casket up the stairs and the fact that he wouldn't fit because there were railings on either side of the steps, and Godfrey McHugh was was too big. He was the wrong size. So we know when the honor guard took the casket in, it's 2,000 hours per their report. And so therefore, we know that McHugh participated in the third casket entry. And we also know, because he's not mentioned by Seibert and O'Neill, that he did not participate in the first entry of the Dallas casket, which was casket entry number 2 at 7/17.
Okay, Elizabeth says there were many moving parts to the autopsy that were well choreographed. Someone had to be overseeing the individual pieces. Do you agree? And any thoughts on who would have been the project manager?
Well, I'm going to use someone else's phrase here. Roy Kellerman was the Secret Service agent in charge on the ground in Dallas. And I have reason to believe he's the one who took the point in telling Dr. Earl Rose, the Dallas County coroner, if you don't get out of the way, you're going to be run over by the casket. We're taking the body to Washington. So he was in charge of making sure that happened. He was apparently in charge of who was allowed into the morgue and who wasn't at various times. So one of the men, I might have been Metzler, one of the corpsmen had to get some film and come back to the morgue with some more film. And one of the Secret Service guys had a list. He had a clipboard and a list. And he says, you're not on the list. I can't let you in. So yes, there was a traffic cop for who could go into the morgue at what time and who couldn't. I believe that's probably Roy Kellerman. And he may have been assisted by some naval officer. He may have received orders from Admiral Galloway or Captain Stover, the head of the medical school. It wouldn't surprise me one bit if somebody was coordinating with him to help him out, to help Kellerman out. But so yes, there was a lot of choreography, and I think the main thing was to keep the people carrying the 3 caskets, doing the 3 casket entries apart from each other, and they did. Those events are well separated in time, and they're each performed by a different audience. So yes, there was a lot of choreography. If it wasn't such a serious subject, it would be a good subject for a French farce, for a comedy movie, a black comedy. That's what David Mantic said to me once. This would be a French farce if it wasn't such a serious subject. But these events really did happen. And yes, there was choreography involved. And even to the extent that when Dr. Fink started causing trouble at the autopsy, asking about entrance wounds and exit wounds, suddenly the Secret Service brings in 3 bone fragments late in the autopsy. I didn't cover this in my slideshow, but the FBI agents wrote about it in their report. He brought in a large bone fragment, 10 by 6.5 centimeters, with a portion of an exit wound in it, and a medium-sized fragment and a small fragment into the morgue. And the Secret Service instructed Dr. Humes and his colleagues that these had been removed. They used the word removed, and provided these skull fragments. And this seemed to satisfy Dr. Fink about, well, okay, a point of exit, at least there's a point of exit in this large loose bone fragment. So yes, there was choreography.
Okay, John Newman, I wasn't given last names. Sorry. John, scratch that last word and erase it from your memory. I enjoyed Doug's pre-recorded presentation. I'm wondering about the throat wound and Dr. Malcolm Perry's tracheostomy performed in Parkland. As I understand it, that was the only significant surgical procedure performed in Dallas. This wound was so completely different when the body arrived at Bethesda that I wonder why the experts that we have come to respect have not emphasized this change to the body as much as the other changes.
Great question by John, not to be named. Yeah, Dr. Perry was adamant that his incision was only 2.5 centimeters, at the most 3 centimeters wide. Of course, 2.5 centimeters is only an inch. It's slightly less than 1 inch. So Dr. Crenshaw was a third-year resident. He was in trauma room 1, and he said Dr. Perry was an artist with the blade. He said that during his interview with ABC News in 1992. So yeah, Dr. Crenshaw looked at the autopsy photographs of the gash in the neck and said, well, this is at least double the size of the trach in Dallas. And he said that, the trach in Dallas wasn't nearly this wide, and it closed of its own volition. Crenshaw said it closed of its own volition after the breathing tube was removed after death. So yes, it's obvious that significant alteration of that wound took place at Bethesda after the body arrived. And I say after the body arrived because we have the Quentin Schwinn medical diagram, which was in my presentation, which shows a hole in the throat with the 2 small 90-degree incisions in it, but very small, no gash in the neck. And Dennis David also recalled seeing a photograph of the president in the morgue with a hole in his neck, not a big gash in his neck. So that clearly took place at Bethesda. And obviously, someone saw the entrance wound in the neck and said, we've got to find this bullet. So they had to enlarge the wound drastically to get to the bullet. If in doing so, they accidentally made it look like an exit, then they got a bonus, didn't they? Because that was the plan anyway. Remove evidence of frontal entry wounds. So I think the primary reason was to try to find the bullet that had hit President Kennedy in the neck. He had severe damage to the tracheal rings in the right side of his trachea. And then Dr. Kemp Clark, the neurosurgeon at Dallas who pronounced him dead, he told the newspapers that weekend that he thought the bullet that entered from the front had ranged downward in the chest and did not exit the body. That was his opinion that weekend. So someone was digging for that bullet, and in the process of looking for it, before the autopsy of record began at 8 o'clock, they clearly had to enlarge that. Now, they didn't use any finesse. So I can only conclude that the intent was not only to get the bullet out, but to make this look like an exit wound. So that's why we have these descriptions by Humes of widely gaping irregular edges, which he put in the autopsy report. And as he said in the autopsy report, it was 6.5 centimeters wide. Well, that's a lot wider than the incision Dr. Perry made, 2.5 centimeters. So in the autopsy report, 6.5 centimeters wide, widely gaping irregular edges. And then in his Warren Commission testimony, Hume said 7 to 8 centimeters wide. So this was done for the same reason that the entry wound was cut out of the forehead to remove evidence of a frontal shot, the same reason. And it has not received as much attention as the other alterations to the skull wounds, and it should, quite frankly. The fact that we don't have any X-rays of a bullet in the body indicates they did find the bullet and they did remove it. And I conclude that it probably was deflected by the trachea and lodged right on top of the right lung without puncturing the pleura. So Dr. Humes, for example, mentions a bruise above the apical portion of the right lung, a bruise in the body above the right lung. So if he's not lying about that, if he's not making that up out of whole cloth, if he's telling the truth about that, that would be where this bullet went in and lodged. It wouldn't have had to go down very far to stop. And it deflected and then stopped. And that would explain how they could get it out by expanding this wound. But the principle is the same. The expansion of that entry wound is the same principle as the excision of this one up here, the removal of evidence of frontal shots. It's equal in importance, and it should be discussed more than it is. I don't know why more people haven't discussed it. but they should, given that Dr. Crenshaw in 1992 on public TV confirmed that he thought that wound had been tampered with. It was double the size that he saw at Parkland.
Okay, William is saying that when you consider the time at which the Dallas casket left Andrews Air Force Base on the way to the Bethesda facility, and then the 8 p.m. official entry of the casket, the Dallas casket, into the morgue. He says, how is this time accounted for? It seems like a long time for a short drive from the Andrews Air Force Base to the Bethesda facility.
Okay, I tried to deal with this in a timeline slide in the presentation. Let me review the essentials. It was about a 45-minute drive from Andrews to Bethesda. So the light gray, it looks white in the black and white photos, the light gray Navy ambulance with the Dallas casket inside did not arrive in front of Bethesda until 6:55. That's documented by Clint Hill and by newspapers. It sat in front for at least 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy went inside the building. She got out of the car immediately and went inside. It sat outside for at least 12 minutes before it moved. So yes, it's a lot of time, and that's exactly the point of my presentation. There's 85 minutes between the time of the arrival of the shipping casket with the president's body inside at 6:35 p.m. and the third casket entry at 8 p.m. That's almost an hour and a half. That's 85 minutes. That's a lot of time for something to be going on. And now we know what was going on. There was an initial examination of the president's wounds. There were some photographs taken of the way he looked when he arrived before there were any manipulations. And then this postmortem surgery took place. Yes, it was profane. It was hurried. It was not pretty. It was an ugly sight to get access to the brain and remove bullets from the brain. In fact, to remove the brain and remove as much metal from the brain as they could find and remove some of the brain tissue. The president then has to be photographed using the head stirrup. That's a pretty slick trick, by the way, to put a fresh towel with the Bethesda emblem on it underneath the head stirrup to make it look like, oh, he's just arrived. This must be the way he looked when he arrived. They put a towel underneath the head stirrup. You don't use a towel during an autopsy. So that was a pretty slick psychological trick. And then after the photos were taken, the skull x-rays had to be taken. The skull x-rays were taken before the body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket. The photos, most of the photos were taken before the body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket. Every photo with the metal stirrup showing, the head brace, was taken before 8 o'clock. All of the skull x-rays. There were either 5 or 6 taken, it's unclear. There are only 3 that survived today, but all the skull x-rays were taken after the postmortem surgery and before the body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket. So as I see it, yeah, there's a lot of time there, almost 90 minutes, but all that time was required to do what they did. And they had just enough time to do what they did and to allow the honor guard to find the casket in a light gray ambulance shortly before 8 o'clock and take it in at 8 o'clock. So I hope that answers the question. It took a long time for the casket to get out there. Then it sat out front for a while, and then it was moved around to the back, and it was empty. The FBI agents didn't know that, but an empty casket was taken in and set in the anteroom. And then the FBI agents were told to leave and go down the hall and sequestered in a different area. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. This will be the last question we ask before we break for the video presentation. John says, do you think the throat wound was caused by a fragment from one of the headshots or caused by another shot from the front?
In my view, it's caused by a shot from the front. It's definitely not caused by a fragment from the headshot. That's one of the lies put into the changing autopsy report, into a version that we don't have anymore. And I'll discuss this tonight in this new presentation that you'll hear. And So I'll just leave it at that. I believe it's caused by a small caliber bullet, probably a 22. There were silenced weapons with silencers that used 22 caliber ammunition.
Well, that's an excellent introduction to the video. So we're going to take a break now to watch this 1 hour video, 1 hour and 5 minutes, and then we'll resume the Q&A at the end of that video.
Good evening. As you can see, the title of this presentation is the Evolving JFK Autopsy Report, managing the presentation of so-called facts to support the myth of a lone assassin in Dallas. Now, when I recorded my original presentation, the JFK Medical Coverup, events at Bethesda Naval Hospital, I did not have time to include this information in that presentation. But since that time, I've reconsidered, and I approached Jacob Hornberger and asked him if we could find time to present this material. And he agreed that it was so important that we should do that. So here we are. And it almost goes without saying as we proceed here that if your only client was the truth, there would not be an evolving JFK autopsy report. If your only client was the truth, there would be no need to keep changing the report. And as you will soon learn, there were 4 sets of conclusions coming out of the autopsy. And the final 3 sets of conclusions were in writing. There were 3 written versions of those conclusions. This is a very sorry state of affairs. Let's continue. I begin with a quote here from George Orwell. Quote, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act," end quote. We live in a world today where we have politics dictated by the media, war filtered and defined and presented by the media, retribution by the media, and sometimes intentional diversion engineered by the media. The mainstream media has become the public relations agent for the executive branch and its intelligence establishment in matters related to national security, in matters related to war and assassination. Regretfully, many people are too busy or too lazy to engage in independent and critical thinking, which involves challenging truths that they are presented with by authority. Independent and critical thinking is certainly not taught up through the 12th grade in American schools. Challenging the pronouncements of authority is essential to a healthy democracy. I firmly believe in that, and I believe it's a basic tenet of all independent JFK citizen researchers. Blind deference to the pronouncements of authority is all too prevalent today. The only thing I'll say in defense of today is that it's much less prevalent than it was 50 or 60 years ago. 50 or 60 years ago, almost everyone believed whatever the government said to be true. At the time President Kennedy was assassinated, a belief in the integrity of the government statements and that the government would do the right thing most or all the time and would tell the truth was at an all-time high. But beginning about 3 or 4 weeks after his assassination, it began to plummet, and it's been eroding rapidly ever since. Now, in the next 5 slides, you will see that there were several versions of the JFK autopsy report. Let's begin with the first written draft. The first written draft was reviewed Saturday, November 23rd, 1963, by Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell at Bethesda. It was then reviewed by Captain Canada, who I remind you was the commanding officer of the treatment hospital at Bethesda. And after struggling with it for 4, 5, or 6 hours Saturday afternoon, Dr. Humes began rewriting it about 11 p.m. Saturday evening at his home and finished the revision at 3 or 4 a.m. Sunday morning. He then destroyed the first draft along with original notes from the autopsy by burning them in his fireplace. Now, this is my construction of what really went down. This is what happened. And yet originally, Dr. Humes presented one version of this to Arlen Specter of the Warren Commission staff. He presented a different version to the House Select Committee, and we got a third version from Dr. Boswell at his review board deposition. So let's reveal how we came to understand this sequence of events. Dr. Humes testified to the HSCA that he began writing the report only at 11 p.m. Saturday. But Dr. Boswell testified to the ARRB that he and Humes began reviewing a typewritten draft at 10 o'clock a.m. Saturday morning at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that they then reviewed the microscopic work, the tissue slides made the night before at the autopsy about noon, and that they then made revisions to the draft report after that. Dr. Fink was not present at the Bethesda review of the first draft. This is a very interesting fact. At the end of John Stringer's deposition, you'll recall he was the official autopsy photographer. At the end of his deposition, I was standing with him in the lobby of Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. He was waiting for his ride to show up. And I said to Stringer, why do you think Dr. Fink wasn't present at the brain exam that you witnessed and photographed? And an enigmatic smile came over his face. And he said, quote, I don't think they wanted Dr. Fink there. He caused too much trouble at the autopsy, end quote. And just as I was about to ask him some follow-on questions, his ride appeared and he drove off. And that was the end of that conversation. But it's important that Fink was not invited to review this typewritten first draft. Now, the Navy letter of transmittal for the autopsy report is dated November 24th, and it states that Captain Canada reviewed it in part and that Humes destroyed, quote, early draft notes, end quote, by burning. The homemade certificate acknowledging the destruction of the notes prepared by Humes stated that he burned, quote, preliminary draft notes, end quote. Now, there's another problem with notes. Dr. Leonard Saslaw, a PhD in chemistry, a food chemist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, a former colleague of Dr. Fink, the third autopsy pathologist, he executed an affidavit for the review board in which he stated that Dr. Fink complained loudly the week after the autopsy that his notes taken at the autopsy had disappeared that night before he left Bethesda to go home. And he was so upset about this, he was sharing it with his lunchtime companions in the lunchroom and speaking quite loudly about it so that it was overheard by Dr. Saslaw. Now, David Lifton discovered this witness and he provided the review board with this lead. We interviewed him independently. We decided he was credible. We prepared an affidavit. He reviewed it. He made a few changes. He signed the affidavit. Now we're still talking about the first written draft. Dr. Humes admitted to Arlen Specter in his Warren Commission testimony that he burned the first draft of the autopsy protocol in his fireplace after revising it. That's a very important statement. After revising it, he burned the first draft. In his HSCA testimony, Humes made a valiant effort to discuss only the destruction of autopsy notes that had blood on them to prevent them from becoming an item of morbid curiosity for collectors. The HSCA counsel questioning him, Mr. Cornwell, showed no curiosity whatsoever or even awareness about the destruction of the first draft. The review board general counsel, Jeremy Gunn, questioned Humes at length about the two alternative descriptions of what he had burned in his fireplace. During this rigorous questioning, Humes admitted twice under oath that he destroyed both the first draft of the autopsy report and the blood-stained working notes from the autopsy to prevent the notes from becoming objects of morbid curiosity. Now, when he admitted to burning both, Jeremy Gunn said to Dr. Humes, well, the first draft didn't have blood on it, did it? You didn't write the first draft during the autopsy. Humes had to admit, no, I didn't write the first draft during the autopsy, and it did not have blood on it. But he admitted burning both under oath before the review board in 1996. Following this exchange, Gunn asked Dr. Humes why he did not destroy the autopsy descriptive sheet. Now, the autopsy descriptive sheet, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is a set of notes. It's a pre-printed form, and on one side are the places to write the weights of the various organs removed from the human body during the autopsy, and it has two sides of a body chart, the front and back of a body chart, where you can draw the wounds. And on the back of this autopsy descriptive sheet, produced at the autopsy on JFK, Dr. Boswell had made his famous freehand sketch of the damage to the top of the skull, showing that almost all the bone was missing from the top of the skull. So Jeremy asked Dr. Humes, why didn't you destroy this page of notes? And he didn't get a good answer. He got a flippant answer from Dr. Humes. Humes could not provide any explanation for this at all. I believe the sketch was essential to selling the enormous damage to the top of JFK's head, the huge skull defect, to selling that as damage caused by an assassin's bullet. That sketch was essential to selling to the audience after 8 o'clock what they were looking at, to selling it to posterity. So, I should just point out that Dr. Humes's demeanor during his review board questioning was at times defensive and at times arrogant. When frustrated and unable to provide answers to tough questions, he alternated between bluster and nonsensical, flippant responses. And in this case, we got a flippant response. Oh, I don't know why I didn't destroy it. Maybe I just felt like keeping it. So that's a response, but it's not an answer. So the first smooth version of the autopsy report, the first version that was signed by all three pathologists on Sunday, November 24th at Bethesda. But it cannot be the signed autopsy report in evidence today. I repeat, it cannot be the signed autopsy report in the National Archives today. All three pathologists told the review board under oath that there was only one signed version of the autopsy report. But careful examination of the autopsy report receipt trail reveals that this cannot be true. And we'll be looking at that receipt trail in the next few slides. The receipt trail indicates that the Secret Service relinquished two different JFK autopsy reports on two occasions to two different parties. The first signed version, relinquished by the Secret Service, was transferred to the custody of Evelyn Lincoln at the request of Robert Kennedy on April 26, 1965, per paragraph 9 of the transfer inventory, which reads in part, quote, complete autopsy protocol of President Kennedy, original in 7 copies, original signed by Dr. Humes, pathologist, end quote. When the Kennedy family was forced by federal statute to relinquish all autopsy materials to the National Archives, they failed to return the items in paragraph 9 on the original inventory listing. The paragraph 9 items included the brain, many tissue slides, many blood slides, memos about autopsy photography, and the original signed autopsy report and 7 copies. Now, the Kennedy family deed of gift document, dated October 29th, 1966, reproduced only 7 of the 9 paragraphs of the April 1965 inventory. Omitted from the deed of gift was the broken casket handle, which was paragraph 1 in the original inventory, and all of the paragraph 9 materials. Now, I would remind you that 2 days after this important deed of gift letter was signed, the materials being returned to the government were returned in a footlocker by the Kennedy family representatives, who immediately left the room. The National Archives persons present immediately compared the two inventories, the original inventory from 65 and the deed of gift letter from 66. Excuse me. And they noted that paragraph 1 and paragraph 9 were missing from the deed of gift letter. And that while the broken casket handle was present, that all of the paragraph 9 materials were missing. They put this in a memo on October 31st, 1966. Now, the autopsy report and evidence today, Commission Exhibit 387, was transmitted by the Secret Service to the National Archives by a letter of transmittal, get this, on October 2nd, 1967, and signed for by the National Archives on October 3rd, 1967. I made this discovery while working on the review board staff, doing my chain of custody study on the autopsy report. The significance is as follows. The Secret Service, therefore, transmitted an original autopsy report twice, a physical impossibility if there was only one signed autopsy report. Let's review what happened. The first signed original was relinquished by the Secret Service on April 26th, 1965. And this was duly noted in the inventory prepared by Dr. Berkeley and signed by Dr. Berkeley and 3 members of the Secret Service. A second signed original was relinquished by the Secret Service on October 2nd, 1967 to the National Archives, where it resides today. I conclude that the Kennedy family never returned the original autopsy report they received in April of 1965 to the US government. If they had, it would have been carefully documented by the Kennedy family attorney, Burke Marshall. Now, I'm going to provide you with my own intelligent speculation on where the missing autopsy report is today, the missing signed version, signed on Sunday, November 24th. I believe the probable location of the missing first signed version is at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, inside the Dallas casket, the heavy bronze casket that weighed over 400 pounds empty, which was dumped at sea from an airplane on February 18th, 1966, at the direct order of Robert F. Kennedy. Some of you may not have known about this, but this is a true story. The documents that document what happened were in response to review board inquiries about the casket, but they weren't released until 1999, the year after we shut down. We shut down on September 30th, 1998. And then during the following year, these documents were suddenly placed in the National Archives. I think the delay was intentional to try to avoid attracting attention to what had happened. Of course, it didn't work. There were articles in the newspaper on the National Wire about this story in 1999. My personal conclusion is that the key paragraph 9 materials on the April 1965 inventory, what remained of Kennedy's brain, tissue and blood slides, autopsy photography memos, and the first signed autopsy report were placed inside the bronze Dallas casket before it was dumped at sea by a C-130 aircraft. Here's why I believe this. A highly trained naval officer, Commander Carlisle Trost, was sent down to a warehouse at Andrews Air Force Base shortly before this airplane took off. I think it was the day before, and to examine the Dallas casket that was going to be dumped at sea to make sure that it would sink. Now, who did they send down there to do this examination? Excuse me. They sent down a man who had already commanded, he'd already been the commanding officer of a nuclear-powered submarine. He already had staff duty in the Pentagon at the time. He was obviously a hot runner, someone destined for bigger and better things, someone that was trusted. You don't need a man who has already commanded a nuclear-powered submarine to tell you whether there are enough holes drilled in a metal casket to make it sink. That's ridiculous. But someone might have trusted him very much to take a sealed package containing the paragraph 9 materials down to Andrews and place it inside the bronze casket before it was sealed and strapped onto a wooden pallet. So, I mean, there were 80 holes drilled in this casket. There were sandbags put in it, very heavy sandbags. There was no doubt it was going to sink. You didn't need Commander Trost to tell you that. We know that the Kennedy family did not return the paragraph 9 materials to the government later that year. We know, as you see in the last paragraph here, that Burke Marshall, the Kennedy family attorney, told the HSCA staff, and this is printed in volume 7 of their report on page 28, that it was his opinion that RFK, quote, obtained and disposed of these materials himself, end quote, and that he was, quote, certain that obtaining or locating these materials is no longer possible, end quote. Now, there's an alternative explanation for where the materials might be, and that explanation was published by Gus Russo in his book. And researcher Gus Russo speculated that the paragraph 9 materials might have been buried in the new gravesite when President Kennedy's casket was reinterred in, I believe it was 1967, circa 1967, moved from its burial site in 1963, just a few feet away, something like 25 or 33 feet away, very close by, into a different burial site where it remains today underneath some very handsome flagstones. Now, we have photographs from the reinterment. It happened late at night. There were only a few people there. One of them was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. There is a wooden box in the photograph sitting on the ground, but the superintendent of Arlington Cemetery, Mr. Metzler, told the House Select Committee that nothing else was put in the new gravesite. Nothing but the huge vault that encased the president's casket was put in the new gravesite. So I defer to his statement. You know, the president's casket, the mahogany casket he was buried in, was placed inside a huge 3,000-pound vault, which was sealed with tar. When the top lid was put on the vault after burial, it was sealed with hot tar. And you can see in the images of the reinterments at night in 1967 that there's a crane lifting this heavy vault through the air into the new gravesite. The vault was never opened. It would have required a lot of work to open it. It was not opened. There were many witnesses to the fact that it was not open. And the superintendent of the cemetery says nothing else was placed in the gravesite. So my speculation is that it's at the bottom of the ocean. If we have to speculate on why Robert Kennedy would have done that, the only benign explanation I can come up with is that he did not want his brother's remains, what remained of his brain and the blood and tissue slides, to become objects of morbid curiosity. You know, the same explanation Humes gave for burning autopsy notes. In Robert Kennedy's case, it may have been the real reason. Now, if he did that, if he dumped these materials at sea inside the Dallas casket, it's a shame, because today, if we had the remains of the brain, we could do DNA testing and determine whether it was tissue from the Kennedy family and authenticate it, essentially, and study what was left of the brain for evidence. But at least we could authenticate it with DNA testing. But we're not going to have access to it. The Dallas casket is in thousands of feet of water in an ammunition dumping area. So it's in an area that's unsafe and very, very deep. And it's completely inaccessible, as Burke Marshall said it was. If the Kennedys had retained this for a future investigation, I think we would have heard about it by now. We would have heard about it and the materials would have been studied, but we haven't heard anything about it. So I think it's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And unfortunately, what went with the brain was the first signed version of the autopsy report. Now, the inevitable conclusion here is that the JFK autopsy report in the National Archives today is only the third written version. It is not a true original. Furthermore, it is an undated document. So we don't know what date it was actually completed and signed. The first draft, reviewed by Humes and Boswell on Saturday, November 23rd at Bethesda, and rewritten by Humes late Saturday night and early Sunday morning, was burned. The first signed version, signed on Sunday the 24th, must therefore be the signed original given to the Kennedy family in April 1965 and listed in paragraph 9 of the April inventory in 1965. It was never returned to the US government, and Burke Marshall, as I've just explained, told the HSCA that RFK had disposed of it, of all the paragraph 9 materials, and that obtaining and locating them was no longer possible. Now, it can clearly be demonstrated that in addition to these timeline problems, the content of the autopsy report changed in each written version. And we'll be discussing this in the next slides, proving that official truth in the JFK assassination was malleable. Therefore, the existing autopsy report, Commission Exhibit 387, would be successfully challenged at trial today if there was a trial, and it would not be admitted into evidence. It is not the first written version, and it's not even the first signed version. And the autopsy conclusions were revised 3 times, which we'll discuss on the next slide. If the existing autopsy report was not admitted into evidence at a trial today, there would be no official conclusion that JFK was hit only from behind and only by 2 shots. That conclusion comes solely from Commission Exhibit 387, this final version of the autopsy report. Now, this may be the most important slide in the presentation. I want you to understand that there were actually 4 sets of conclusions about what happened to President Kennedy during the shooting. The first set was an oral set of conclusions announced by Dr. Humes at the autopsy before 11 o'clock. That's when the FBI agents departed. The next 3 sets of conclusions were put in writing in various versions of the autopsy report. So let's go through these 4 sets of conclusions. So before 11 o'clock p.m., Dr. Humes made a grand announcement to the morgue audience. The pattern was clear, he said. The president was hit by 2 shots from behind, 1 in the head, 1 entry wound low in the back of the head, and 1 in the back. And as described at the time, the back wound was shallow and did not exit the body, did not transit the body. In fact, Humes's public charade before the morgue audience from 8 to 11 had him announcing that he couldn't find a bullet in the body, represented by the shallow back wound. He couldn't find a bullet. And then when he was informed later that a bullet had been found on a stretcher in Dallas, he assumed that it was that bullet, and so that ostensibly satisfied him at the time. Now, we know that the body was turned over to Gawler's funeral home morticians at 11:45. We know that from some of their documents, which survived and which were authenticated by Mr. Hagan to the review board. So sometime between 11 and 11:45, this set of conclusions changed. And the reason we know that is there's a person named Lieutenant Lipsey, who was once the aide to General Wheel. Now, General Wheel was the commandant of the military district of Washington. He was responsible for the 4 days of ceremonies surrounding President Kennedy's burial and funeral. And his aide was Lieutenant Lipsey. So Lieutenant Lipsey was interviewed by the HSCA staff in 1978. And he told them he was absolutely certain that he heard the chief pathologist announce that there were 3 hits from behind, not 2, and that anyone who said there were only 2 hits didn't know what they were talking about.
He was really sure of himself. And he was so sure of himself, he drew a diagram for the HSCA, which I've published in volume 1 of my book. And his diagram shows 3 hits: bullet 1, bullet 2, and bullet 3. Now, his bullet 1 is the bullet in the head that enters in the head and exits from elsewhere on the head. His bullet 3 is the shallow back wound, which enters high in the back and doesn't exit the body. His bullet number 2 is new information that Humes did not announce prior to 11 o'clock. His bullet number 2 enters low in the back of the head, and he draws a dot where it entered, very low in JFK's head, near the hairline, and exited the tracheotomy site, if you can believe that. Now, one reason to believe Lieutenant Lipsey and to believe that he's telling the truth about what he heard between 11 and 11:45, and to not believe he's mistaken, is that Tom Robinson, the Gawler's funeral home mortician interviewed by the review board in 1996, told us that he recalled Dr. Humes inserting a long metal probe very low in the back of the president's head, and that eventually the probe exited the front of the throat, where the tracheotomy site was. I'm going to repeat that. Tom Robinson recalled to the review board, to a room full of review board witnesses, that Dr. Humes inserted a probe low in the back of the head, which eventually exited from the tracheotomy site in the front of the neck. Never mind how ridiculous that is. For a bullet to do something like that, it would have to miraculously somehow transit the foramen magnum. That's the hole at the bottom of your skull that your spinal cord and your cervical vertebrae go through. The vertebrae that support your skull go through the foramen magnum. A bullet would have had to have gone through there and then somehow come out the front of your neck without striking cervical vertebrae. But that's what he witnessed with a probe. Oddly enough, Dr. Humes mentioned to his next door neighbor, and this is in the set of CBS memos, which I discussed in the first presentation, he mentioned an X-ray of a probe going through the neck, coming out the tracheotomy site. Of course, that X-ray is not in the collection today, but he mentioned such an X-ray. So Humes seems to corroborate Robinson, and Robinson certainly corroborates Lipsey's bullet number 2. So I invite you to look at that diagram he made. It's in volume 1 of my book. Now, the conclusions changed again on Sunday. My conclusion, by the way, is that the Lipsey scenario, the 3 shots hitting JFK from behind, which I just discussed, that was the contents of the first draft of the autopsy report, the typewritten draft reviewed by Humes and Boswell Saturday morning at 10 a.m. It makes sense. If that's what Lieutenant Lipsey heard Humes say very late, after 11 o'clock p.m. at the autopsy and before 11:30 p.m., then it's likely what Humes put in the first typewritten draft, which he arrived at Bethesda with in his hand, already typed at 10 a.m. Saturday morning. By the way, here's what I think happened. Dr. Humes called Dr. Perry in Dallas after the FBI agents left the morgue. And Dr. Perry proceeded to tell him about a bullet wound in the throat and that it was a shot from the front. It was an entry wound. Well, this created a serious problem for Dr. Humes. His instructions clearly, I mean, we know today his instructions had to have been to not discuss any shots from the front, to only report shots from the rear, and to try to obliterate or remove evidence of shots from the front, and certainly not to report them. So he had a problem now. He had Dr. Perry reporting to him on the phone an entrance wound from the front, in the front of the neck, in the throat. So somehow he had to turn that into an exit wound. So I want to point out to you that Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist at the autopsy, said in his HSCA testimony in 1978 that he thought there was a phone call with Dallas, from the morgue to Dallas, about 10:30 p.m. And later in his deposition, he said, you know, it might have been later than that. Might have been later that night. Well, I'm telling you, it was later than that. It was after 11, because the FBI agents left at 11. Dr. Hume said that twice under oath. So if they had heard a 3-hit scenario, they would have put that in their report, which they wrote the day after the funeral, November 26th. But no, that's not what they put in their report. They put the 2-hit scenario in their report that Hume's announced before 11 o'clock. So this phone call did take place. Dr. Ebersol was just about half an hour off, or maybe 35 or 40 minutes off in time. It did happen late that night. And by the way, the dot that Lieutenant Lipsey put in his diagram for the entry site for his bullet number 2 is exactly where we see a white spot on the photographs of the back of the president's head. The photographs from the autopsy that show the back of the president's head supposedly intact show a red spot up high near the corner of a ruler, which the Clark panel and the HSCA wanted to be the entrance wound. It also shows a so-called white spot, which looks white in the black and white photos published by the HSCA, low in the head, very low in the head, near the hairline, just above the neck. That's where Lipsey put his dot for the entrance of bullet number 2. And I'm telling you that when I examined the digitized scans of the autopsy photos at Kodak in Rochester, New York, we had the autopsy images digitized by Kodak for preservation purposes. When we examined the blowups of the digital scans on high resolution monitors, this white spot didn't look like a white spot anymore. It looked like a puncture in the skull with brain matter, bloody brain matter oozing out of it. It was tissue extruding from a wound, very clearly. And by the way, Dr. Fink agrees with my assessment. I was recently reviewing his testimony before the HSCA. And when he was questioned about that photo, he said that he thought it depicted tissue extruding from a wound in the skull. So he and I had the same impressions looking into this photo, and this was exactly where Lipsey said bullet number 2 entered. It's exactly where Tom Robinson said a probe entered the back of the skull and then later came out the front of the neck. The implications are very disturbing. So a new scenario, back to only 2 hits from behind, arrives on November 24th. That's the day the first autopsy report is signed. The first signed version is created on the 24th. And we know that we're back to a 2-hit scenario because of the official press leaks about what was in this autopsy report. Now, I'll get into the press leaks in just a moment, but the press leaks quote the autopsy pathologists, and they say that the autopsy report says that the wound in the throat was caused by a fragment from the headshot, not from a bullet, not from a whole bullet. I say again, this report signed on Sunday said that the throat wound seen in Dallas was caused by a fragment from the headshot. Well, this was very inventive by Dr. Humes and his colleagues. I don't know if he thought of it himself or if he was directed to say that, but it's very inventive by somebody. Now, I don't think this version lasted more than 2 days before it had to be abandoned, because if you examine the Zapruder film, it clearly shows President Kennedy reacting to a strong stimulus to his neck, some stimulus to his neck, by raising his 2 forearms with clenched fists, raising them in front of his face, in front of his neck. A defensive response, apparently. And the head explosion does not occur until much later in the Zapruder film. So his reaction to a throat stimulus, to some stimulus to his neck, occurs long before the head explosion does in the Z film. So that film began to proliferate on Tuesday, the 26th. More and more people begin to view it, copies of it. And I'm sure very quickly after this report was signed on Sunday, somebody said, oh no, we've got to change the autopsy report again. We can't have this in the record. It's contradicted by the Zapruder film. So this version signed on Sunday, which went back to a 2-hit scenario, had something else in it that was odd. According to what Dr. Fink told the Clay Shaw defense team in Clay Shaw's trial in New Orleans in 1969, Dr. Fink told his defense team that the brain had been severed from the spinal cord by the assassin's bullet, as described in the autopsy report. That's a direct quote from the defense counsel documents, quote of what Fink said, that was described in the autopsy report. Well, if you look at the autopsy report today, you don't have to go to the archives. You can pull out your Warren Commission and read it. There's no mention of the brain being severed from the spinal cord by the assassin's bullet. But yet Fink was saying in 1969 that was in the autopsy report. In other words, it's in the report he signed. It was in the report he signed. So, ending up here, Commission Exhibit 387, that's in the archives today. It's the only signed autopsy report in the archives today, which was shown to the Dallas doctors on December 11th by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. It says there were 2 hits from behind. One was the headshot. But now the entry wound in the back is no longer a shallow wound that didn't go anywhere. It's now been changed in the report to a bullet that transited the neck and came out the front of the throat at the tracheotomy site. So for the very first time, Dr. Humes and his colleagues have stated in writing that a bullet entered high in the back, transited his neck, and came out the front of his throat. But they didn't say that in writing until the 3rd written version of the autopsy report. Really critical to understand that. Now, this is a micro study of the press leaks. These are official leaks from the government to the press for the purpose of getting them in the media, getting them in the public mind. And they occurred on, they were published on December the 18th, as you see here, in 2 newspapers, and on December 27th in Time magazine. And just in case you didn't read the Post or the Inquirer, everybody read Time magazine. So both published articles quoting the findings of the pathologist in the autopsy report talk about 2 bullets. In the newspaper articles written by Nate Hazeltine, it says that the first bullet hit Kennedy 5 to 7 inches below the collar line, and that the bullet was found. This is so important, I put it in red. The bullet was found deep in his shoulder. This is really interesting. First of all, the 5 to 7 inches below the collar line is consistent with the holes in JFK's clothing, which are between 5 and 7 inches below the collar of his coat and the collar of his shirt. The autopsy report today in the archives doesn't talk about any bullet found deep in his shoulder, but these leaks did, these official leaks did. And this confirms what Paul O'Connor told the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977, before he talked to any JFK researchers. He told them that he was kicked out of the morgue for about 40 minutes, placed under guard by the Marines in the hallway, and when he went back in the morgue, he was told by one of his colleagues who had stayed in the room that a bullet was found between Kennedy's ribs in his back and was removed from intercostal tissue. Well, this confirms that Paul O'Connor wasn't making this up. Now, the second bullet, according to the Nate Hazeltine article, tore off the right rear portion of Kennedy's head so destructively as to be incompatible with life, and that a fragment was deflected from this headshot and passed out the front of the throat. Excuse me. Notice, first of all, that these leaks are talking about damage to the right rear portion of the head. That's really interesting. That's what everybody at Parkland Hospital saw, the right rear portion of the head damage. That's what almost every Bethesda witness saw. That's not what's in the autopsy photographs, but they're still talking about the real exit wound in the head in this leak. But then they say a fragment from this headshot was deflected and passed out the front of the throat. It's clear from its context, they're talking about the headshot bullet, a fragment passed out the front of the throat. Now, in the Time magazine article, there's no ambiguity anymore. First of all, they still talk about a back wound 6 inches below the collar line. They say it had penetrated 2 or 3 inches. They don't say anymore whether it had been removed or not. It's almost as if somebody said, oops, we better not say removed. We better say it penetrated 2 or 3 inches. But it's crystal clear in the Time magazine article that the throat wound seen by the Parkland physicians was made by a fragment from the exploding headshot bullet. I read, quote, "The throat wound had been made by a fragment of the last bullet, which literally exploded in Kennedy's head," end quote. There's no ambiguity here. So it's not made by a whole bullet. It's made by a fragment, and the fragment comes from the headshot. So these are the contents of this version signed on the 24th, along with the fact that it also said the brain was severed from the spinal cord by the bullet. We know that was in that report too. Now, I just mentioned this, Pierre Shaw made this statement to the Clay Shaw defense team. The problem is it's not stated in the autopsy report we have today in the National Archives. It doesn't say the brain was severed from the spinal cord. Now, there's a transcript that exists, a verbatim transcript made by a court reporter of an executive session transcript of the Warren commissioners with their lead attorney, J. Lee Rankin, on January 27th, 1964. It was formally classified top secret. If they'd been smart, they would have kept it classified because it reveals utter and total confusion by the people talking about the wounds. The first 3 quotes here are by Rankin. "Then there is a great range of material in regard to the wounds," he said, "and the autopsy and this point of exit or entrance of the bullet in the front of the neck. And that all has to be developed much more than we have at the present time," end quote. So you can see, he's not sure in his own mind, their lead staff attorney, whether this wound in the throat is an exit or an entrance. It sounds like he's been paying attention to the early press reports. Maybe he heard Dr. Perry say that at the death press conference. Maybe he read the early newspaper reports and read about an entrance wound in the throat. But he's clearly aware that later these reports say it's an exit. So he's very confused about that. Then he says, we have an explanation there in the autopsy that probably a fragment came out the front of the neck. There's 2 important things about this sentence. He says fragment came out the front of the neck. We know what he's talking about from the press leaks on the previous slide. He's talking about a fragment from the headshot that came out the front of the neck. The official press leaks, press reports reveal that that's what he means here. That's the context of his use of the word fragment. You note he says in the autopsy, an explanation in the autopsy. He doesn't say an explanation in the Washington Post, in the Philadelphia Inquirer, or in Time magazine. So it's as if he has the actual first signed version of the report in front of him. And I think he may have had, because he says the explanation here in the autopsy that a fragment came out the front of the neck. He means in an autopsy report. So he continues in his confusion, quote, "It seems quite apparent now, since we have the picture of where the bullet entered in the back, that the bullet entered below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the picture shows the bullet came out in the neckband of the shirt in front. And the bullet, according to the autopsy, didn't strike any bone at all, and that bullet and went through," end quote. Confusing syntax, but you can see what he's saying. He's referencing a photograph of the back wound and saying that that bullet that caused the back wound went through the neck and came out the front of the neck. Now, he says something incorrect that it went through the neckband of the shirt. That's not true. We know from Dr. Carrico, who was interviewed in the mid-60s by Harold Weisberg, and whose interview was, published in Post-Mortem by Harold Weisberg, that the entry wound in the throat was above the collar. The bullet did not go through the collar. It did not penetrate the neckband of the shirt, as Rankin thought. There are two slits in the shirt where you button the top button on the shirt, where you button the shirt collar. And there's a nick in the tie, but those two slits in the collar band and the nick on the tie are caused by scalpels. It's very clear from the interview of nurses, and I believe from Carrico's interview, that these are scalpel cuts from the hurried removal of the president's clothing during his emergency treatment. Nurses are in a hurry, and they always remove clothing with scissors and scalpels just to get it off of the person so his wounds can be examined. Now, Commissioner Hale Boggs, in response to Rankin, says, quote, "I thought I read that bullet just went in a finger's length." Now, it's clear he's talking about the entry wound in the upper back. And when he says, "I thought it just went in a finger's length," he's talking about what's in the FBI summary report, which came out in December. And then a supplemental report was also put out by the FBI in January. So he's referring to a shallow back wound, which is the charade that Seibert and O'Neill witnessed Humes talking about. I can feel the end of the wound with my little finger. There's no bullet in here. I don't know where the bullet is. There's no bullet in the body, all that stuff. So that was memorialized in their report written November 26th, and that remained in all the FBI reports. That's what Hale Boggs is referring to. And Rankin responds to him by saying, well, that's what they first said. It's a pretty sad state of affairs. There's conflicting evidence in different reports, and these men are hopelessly confused. What this all reveals is that there was an incompetent cover-up about the throat wound, revealed by a timeline of statements. Let's go through them as quickly as we can. It's worth going through these in detail because it reveals how sloppy and how incompetent this cover-up was. White House transcript 1327C recorded the comments of Dr. Perry and Dr. Clark at the death press conference, the afternoon President Kennedy died. This is the press conference where the Secret Service reportedly confiscated the videotape shortly thereafter. And later, when the Warren Commission asked the Secret Service if there was a transcript of it, Secret Service lied and said no. But if you look at White House transcript 1327C, you'll see that it has a Secret Service date timestamp on it that reads as follows, quote, received by the U.S. Secret Service, 1963, November 26, a.m., 11:40, Office of the Chief, end quote. That's a pretty damning timestamp. The Secret Service did have a transcript. It was made by White House recorder Wayne Hawks. It was his job to record press conferences. And he did in that afternoon with his machine. He was a court reporter and he made a verbatim transcript. And in that transcript, Dr. Perry stated 3 times, JFK had a bullet entrance wound in his neck, a bullet fired from the front, without any ambiguity. Okay, so the first draft of the autopsy report, per Richard Lipsey's 3-shot scenario that he gave the House Select Committee, the first draft of the autopsy report said that bullet number 2 entered low in the back of the skull, where the white spot is in the photos, and exited the throat. So this first draft, reviewed by Humes and Boswell Saturday morning, which surely had in it the Lipsey scenario, said that the throat wound was now caused by a bullet exiting, not entering. So Dr. Perry said it was a bullet entering from the front. This first draft of the autopsy report said it was an exiting bullet. It was reversed. Now, the first signed version of the report, signed on Sunday, November 24th, which we've been talking about, said the throat wound was caused by an exiting fragment from the headshot. We just talked about all that. So we've gone now, these first three bullet points, from an entrance wound in the front of the neck to an exit wound for a whole bullet in the front of the neck to a little hole caused by an exiting fragment from the headshot. This story keeps changing. Now, there was an outrageous lie, an outright lie published by Life magazine in its December 6th, 1963 issue. There's no way it can be a mistake. It's a blatant lie because they owned the film and they would have known what the contents of the film were. And this lie says, but the other bullet, the doctor reported, entered the president's throat from the front and then lodged in his body. Hence the recurring guess that there was a second sniper somewhere else. But the 8mm film, they're talking about the Zapruder film, the film they own, shows the president turning his body far around to the right as he waves to someone in the crowd. His throat is exposed toward the sniper's nest just before he clutches it, end quote. Anybody who's seen the Zapruder film, even one time, knows this is a lie. And they got away with this because Life magazine never licensed the film to be shown as a motion picture from 1963 to 1975. I repeat, from 63 to 75, the public never saw the Zapruder film as a motion picture. The Time Life didn't allow it. The film was only shown to the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission staff. Only in 1975, when the public saw the film for the first time, did we become aware that this was a blatant falsehood. And that was the year when Robert Groden showed his bootleg copy of the film on ABC TV. After which Time Life sold it back to the family, the Zapruder family, for $1. They didn't have any more interest in the cover-up at that point. They'd already been burned, so they sold it and got rid of it for $1. Okay. The FBI summary report of December 9th and their supplemental report of January 13th reported the findings of Agent Seibert and O'Neill, of those two agents, which were put in their 302 report of November 26th. So their observations were memorialized in their report of the 26th of November, and they kept reappearing in official FBI reports. And that was that no bullet wound of the neck was acknowledged at all. And I'm talking about no transiting bullet. That's what I mean here. No transiting bullet wound of the neck was acknowledged at all by either the FBI or the Secret Service. To this day, remains the state of affairs. To this day, the FBI position and the Secret Service position remains unchanged. And their position then and now is that two bullets hit President Kennedy from behind. One hit him in the skull. One hit him in the back and created a shallow wound and did not transit the body. That is the official position today of both of those federal agencies. Now, the second signed autopsy report, the version in the archives today, was shown to the Dallas doctors at Parkland Hospital on December 11th, 1963, by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. He wrote a report about this. This was a not so subtle way of telling the Dallas doctors, you guys were wrong. You guys talked about an entrance wound in the throat, but this report says it's an exit wound. This report says it's an exit wound for a bullet that entered high in the back and then came out the front of the neck. So it was a way of telling them you're wrong. Now, based on the executive session transcript that I quoted from just a moment ago, Mr. Rankin had two alternate versions of the autopsy report before him and a contradicting FBI report. Remember, he's talking about a fragment from the headshot coming out the front of the throat. Well, that's in a missing autopsy report. That's in the one signed on Sunday. He was also talking about a bullet that went in high in the back and transited the neck and came out he said, and went through the shirt collar. Actually, that bullet hole was above the shirt collar. But anyway, he's aware of both versions. He's also aware of a contradicting FBI report, because that's the one Hale Boggs is quoting. And that's where Rankin says, well, that's what they first said. So this is a real mess, and it indicates incompetence at the highest levels of this cover-up. So I'm going to conclude with a few slides that put this in the proper perspective. President Kennedy gave a speech in 1962 in support of the Voice of America. He said, quote, "We seek a free flow of information. We are not afraid to entrust the American people with unpleasant facts. For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people," end quote. Well, you can apply this to a lot of situations, and you can especially apply this to the JFK medical evidence. There has been no free flow of information. The story kept changing, and nobody in the government wants to admit this or talk about it. Now, there's a famous quote attributed to Galileo. It may be apocryphal. It may be that he never actually said it, but it's worked its way into some of his biographies. And the quote is, "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." Now, Galileo had a sense of drama and a large ego, so he's talking about himself here. He was engaged in this battle with the church, where he was placed on house arrest for the rest of his life, because he claimed that the earth was not the center of the universe, which the church thought it was. He claimed the sun was the center of the universe, and that the earth revolved around the sun. He was supporting Copernicus. The Catholic Church was opposing Copernicus, wanting to believe that the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun revolved around the earth. So this was him defending his own genius and his own courage. But it can be applied to a lot of situations. And I think this can be applied to anyone who studies the JFK medical evidence and comes to independent conclusions through the use of critical thinking, instead of deferring to the pronouncements of authority, which is dangerous. Benjamin Franklin once said, "It is the duty of every citizen to challenge authority." That's a fantastic quote. It particularly applies to the Kennedy assassination. Now, these are the lessons of the JFK medical evidence in this regard. Don't succumb automatically and uncritically to arguments based on authority when it comes to important topics, such as how wars begin and how assassinations are explained. Study the evidence yourself and engage in critical thinking. When you experience cognitive dissonance, it means something. And finally, the federal government and the national media in America have abjectly failed us in regard to the JFK assassination. Don't let it happen again. Don't allow authority figures to do your thinking for you. Do not blindly accept the conclusions of others if they are not supported by the weight of the evidence. So the lesson here is, don't always disbelieve the government, but if the government tells you something about an important event, you should want to see the evidence first before you decide whether you believe the explanation that authority has provided to you. If the evidence you see matches the explanation provided by authority, then fine, go ahead and believe what they told you. But if the explanation doesn't agree with what you were told by authority, and the story keeps changing, you know there's a problem, and you need to focus in on that subject. So I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this presentation useful. And once again, thanks a lot to Jacob for allowing me to make this additional presentation. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think we're back live for the continuation of the Q&A. Thanks for that excellent presentation, Doug. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
what I'd like to do, I know that the sand is running through the hourglass. I need 6 or 7 minutes to present 2 images, and then I'll be quiet and listen to some more questions.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
Okay, let me begin here. There we go. I forgot to mention in my presentation that the naval officer who was sent down to inspect the Dallas casket before the Air Force dumped it at sea became the chief of naval operations. So that name I was giving you, Carlisle Trost, the reason I was giving you that name is he later became the chief of naval operations, the most highly ranked officer in the Navy in the late 1980s under the first George Bush. I just thought I'd let you know that. Okay, I'd like to show 2 images and then we'll go back to Q&A. So bear with me, please. Okay, I spoke to you about the Richard Lipsey 3-hit scenario that Dr. Humes delivered between 11 o'clock p.m. when the FBI agents left and 11:45 p.m. when the morticians took over JFK's body. This is the diagram that he made. There's his signature and the dates, 1978. This is the diagram he made for the House Select Committee. So I just want to show you his wound number 1 right here. It went in the head and went out in the same area. That's what he said. Okay. His wound number 3 is the back wound, which he was insisting, if you read their interview report of him, he's insisting that it's a shallow back wound that doesn't exit the body. But his wound number 2 is the one of interest. Look at how low it is in the head. If you go back and look at the back of the head so-called autopsy photos, the so-called white spot is exactly right here. It's right at the hairline, just above the neck. So this is where his bullet 2 enters. And here's the exit point for his bullet number 2. Bullet 2 enters here. Bullet 2 exits here. So this, I'm as sure as I can be, is the content of the first draft of the autopsy report, which was typed by 10 a.m. Saturday, reviewed by Humes and Boswell, rejected by Dr. Canada later in the day, and probably by others, and then burned on Sunday. And Sunday, when a new one was written, it went back to a 2-hit scenario. So that takes care of this image. I want you to know about this. It's in volume 1 of my book, but not everybody's going to read my book. I understand that. So now you know what his diagram looks like. One more image here. It's very important. See if I can go to, I don't need to go to full screen. I think this is good enough. You can see the image, right, Jacob?
Yes, I can see it. Fine.
Okay. This is the so-called mystery photo. Now, I mentioned this briefly in my first presentation. I want to tell you about this image because it's the source of the greatest controversy among the autopsy photos, other than the back of the head looking intact. That's the most controversial set of images, but this is the next most controversial set. Now, I want to tell you how the descriptions of this by Dr. Humes, the way he treated this image, changed over time. Then you will see how dishonest this whole autopsy exercise was, what a charade everything was, how many times he changed his mind about what this depicted. Now, Dr. Humes met with Boswell and Stringer, the photographer, and Ebersol, the radiologist, on November 1st, 1966. And they created an inventory, and they put a number to each photo and they described what it showed. That's all they did. This is the day after the Kennedy family turned the materials back over to the government. So Dr. Humes called this photograph a picture of the entry wound in the posterior skull. Look at my image, folks. Your posterior skull is the back of your head. Posterior is back. This is anterior. The posterior is the back of your head. Dr. Hume said in the inventory listing, this is the back of the head. He also said there's an entrance wound in it, which is BS. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, Paul O'Connor, Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor, looked at this bootleg image in later years and said, oh, yes, that is the back of the head. He said, this is the part where all the bone is missing on the right side in the back and then in the top. So this is the right side of the back of the head right here. And Dr. Mantic and Dr. Chesser, they have some minor disagreements, but in general, I think this is more or less the center line, more or less, going in this direction. So that this part over here would be the right side of the skull, and this part over here is the left side. This is reflected scalp. This is the skull plate. So, and oh, by the way, Dr. Mantic will explain to you, this is where the Harper fragment fits. The Harper fragment is occipital bone, and it fits right here. And he's going to show you that in his lecture in 2 weeks. I'm sure he is. So Dr. Humes described this as the back of the head. Now, there's something else very interesting in this photograph. It's this. The House Select Committee described this as a beveled exit wound. This is what they called it, their forensic medical panel, that it's a portion of an exit wound. It's a semicircle, and it's beveled or cratered on the outer surface of the skull, the surface you're looking at. You would think that anyone that saw this at an autopsy would mention it in the autopsy report. Guess what? In the autopsy report, you can find it in your Warren Commission report or online. Dr. Humes does not mention this. This is in the skull plate. This is on the edge of the large skull defect that Boswell drew a sketch of. He does not mention this. Dr. Hume says in the autopsy report that the only evidence of exit was in a large bone fragment brought to him late in the autopsy by the Secret Service. The bone fragment that was 10 by 6.5 centimeters, and that it had a semicircular notch in it that was evidence of exit. He doesn't mention this at all. It gets worse. In his Warren Commission testimony, Dr. Humes specifically testified that there was no evidence of exit in the edge of the large cranial defect. I repeat, he said under oath there was no evidence of exit in the edge of the large cranial defect. Folks, this is in the edge of the large cranial defect. So he went from not mentioning it in the autopsy report to specifically denying it in his testimony. Now, a strange thing happened. The Justice Department assembled the three pathologists in January '67. I call the report they signed the military review. Other people, because it's signed by the three military pathologists. Other people call it the Justice Department review. Either name is fine, but the Justice Department assembled them, and the Justice Department appears to have rubbed their nose in it. So the Justice Department wanted to marry up the photos and x-rays with the autopsy report, marry the two together. So this report that they signed in January '67, written by the Justice Department, says that this is half of the circumference of an exit wound. And it then says that the other half of the exit wound is in this is the x-ray of the three large skull fragments. This is the largest of the three skull fragments brought into the morgue during the autopsy. This is the evidence of exit, a semicircular notch in that bone fragment, which we don't have today. We don't know where it is. So the Justice Department review that the doctor signed said that this, when married with this, described the entrance wound in the right parietal bone. And so the military review prepared by the Justice Department, signed by the doctors, would have you believe that this is the right front of the head, that this is the right parietal bone. That's nonsense. Dr. Hume said in the listing that this is the posterior skull. Okay. This is how bad this case really is. And it shows you how willing people were willing to lie, change their stories, and go along with whatever authority wanted them to say to make everybody happy. Now, it gets even worse. Before the House Select Committee, and that's the end of my story about this photograph, before the House Select Committee, Hume's got grilled about this. And one of the doctors examining him said, well, this looks to me like the doctor thought it was in the frontal bone. That this would be Kennedy's face down here with the scalp folded down, that this would be Kennedy's face, and that this would be Kennedy's frontal bone above his forehead. And Dr. Hume said, no, that's not in the frontal bone. It's the only one of the few times he stood up to anybody. He said, no, that's either parietal or temporal. He said, it's not in the frontal bone. Many pages later in the transcript, by the end of the examination of Hume's, they have him agreeing that this is frontal bone. A different doctor says, you know, I think this is in the frontal bone just forward of the coronal suture. Well, folks, the coronal suture goes here from ear to ear. It's a suture in the bone, and it goes from here to here. And the doctor was saying that this wound, that this defect was right up here in the frontal bone, forward of the coronal suture. And Humes changes his mind and agrees with this guy by the end of his testimony. This all by itself is an encapsulated story of how dishonest this whole case is and the whole autopsy is. So those are the end of my pictures for tonight. Unless somebody wants to see some more, I'm ready. Jacob, go ahead.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left of Q&A. Jeff has two questions regarding the wounds. He says, would you please describe Hume's differing or evolving descriptions of the beveled semicircular notch in the skull plate in photos 17, 18, 44, and 45?
I just did that.
Okay. Number two is, would you describe the differences between how Humes and Boswell and Fink described the entrance wound in the back of the head?
I'd like to do that. Yes, that's good. We asked Dr. Humes, who we deposed first before we did Boswell, if the entrance wound in the back of the head was a complete circular wound in a solid plate of bone, circular bullet wound in a solid plate of bone, or whether it was a portion of a crater at the edge of a large defect. Because we know Dr. Boswell had said the latter, and Dr. Fink had said the latter, that it was a portion of a crater at the edge of a large defect in the back of the head. Dr. Humes told us, no, it's a through and through hole in a solid plate of bone. Oh, really? So then we asked Dr. Humes, was any of the right rear of the skull missing? And he says, no, the right rear of the skull was somewhat fragmented, but it was all held together and there was no hole in the back of the head on the right side. So then I believe it was about a week later, 1 or 2 weeks later, we deposed Boswell, and he drew the famous diagram and a skull model for us, showing that the bone was not only missing in the entire top of the skull, but it was missing on the right side, and the whole right side of the rear of the head was missing. So he drew us this 3-dimensional version of his 2-dimensional sketch that he made at the autopsy. And then, of course, we knew that Boswell had told the HSCA medical panel that the entrance wound in the back of the head was only a portion of a circle. It was a semicircle, and everything above it was gone. All the bone above it was gone. And he said that as the 3 fragments were brought into the morgue late during the autopsy, the middle of those fragments, the medium-sized one, completed the circumference of the entry wound. And Dr. Fink agreed with Boswell, essentially, in his notes to General Bloomberg in 1965, Fink wrote that the entrance wound was a portion of a crater, just a portion of a small crater going into the skull. So you have Fink agreeing with Boswell that the entrance wound is not well defined, it's just a portion of a crater. Boswell explaining to both the House committee and to the review board under oath that that middle fragment, the middle-sized bone fragment brought into the morgue, completed the circumference of the entry wound low in the back of the head. But Boswell also admitted that everything above it was gone until somebody brought him that fragment. So of course it was gone. The exit wound in the right rear of the head seen in Dallas at Parkland created a big blowout right above the entrance wound in the back of the head. So that's why certainly nobody saw that entrance wound at Parkland. It was obscured by the big exit. So we have Boswell and Fink basically agreeing that the entrance wound in the back of the head, as they palpated it with their fingers and looked at it, was a portion of a small entrance crater. And then Boswell explaining it was only completed later when a bone fragment was brought in. The middle sized of the three bone fragments on the X-ray I showed you. So there's complete disagreement here between Fink and Boswell on the one hand and Humes on the other. And that's worth noting. Also, one of the few things, though, that the three pathologists agreed on, one of the very few, is that they all agreed that the location of the entrance wound in the back of the skull was slightly above the EOP, the external occipital protuberance, the bump in the back of your head that's more or less halfway up your ears. It's just slightly above that and about 2.5 centimeters to the right. So it was the Clark panel and the HSCA that moved the entrance wound up 4 inches, 100 millimeters up higher to where you see a red spot in the photograph of the back of the head. So I know Dr. Aguilar is going to get into all that, what the Clark panel did, how they disagreed with the autopsy, and how the HSCA agreed with the Clark panel. So I'm going to leave the rest of that to Dr. Aguilar, but so I think that answers the second question that Jeff had.
Okay, Bob asks, I have a question about the 3-shot skull you showed at the start of tonight's event, and then the Audrey Bell story from Parkland. There seems to be a contradiction there. If he had a temple entry and a parietal exit wound, why wouldn't Nurse Bell see any wound until the head was turned to show the large rear exit wound?
The president didn't have a parietal exit wound anywhere on the right side or the right front of his head. That's a lie, or if you want to be generous, it's a bad interpretation of evidence by the Justice Department and the HSCA medical panel. Okay. Let me explain how these entrance wounds, I showed you the diagram. Let me explain to you how in my mind, where the exit wounds are for those entrances. The bullet which entered the right temple from the right front caused a big blowout seen in Dallas in the right rear of the head. Okay. The bullet high in the forehead above the right eye did not cause the big blowout seen at Parkland Hospital, because the fragment trail, which Dr. Chesser will talk about next week, the fragment trail for that entry wound high above the right eye begins above the right eye and goes up, straight back to where we see, this is my explanation, that semicircular beveled notch in the back of the head. Yes, it's probably in the parietal bone right above where the occipital bone ends, but it's in the back of the head. So the entrance wound above the right eye, I'm going to slow down and say this again. The entrance wound above the right eye, the fragment trail for that goes up. It doesn't go down toward the big blowout seen at Parkland. So this wound that enters here exits, I believe, where you see the semicircular beveled notch in the photo of the posterior skull. That wound would have been obscured by blood and hair at Parkland, and nobody would have seen it. They didn't shave the hair at Parkland, and they didn't do an autopsy. They saw the one big thing that was undeniable, a big blowout and a avulsed wound in the right rear of the head, lower than that, missing scalp and skull.
Okay.
And the bullet which entered, I'm sorry, Jacob, the bullet which entered low in the rear of the head, I don't think it exited the skull at all. It hit the orbit of the right eye. That's why the orbit of the right eye was cracked, fractured. The right eye was divergent, looking in the wrong direction, and popped out a little bit. And I believe that bullet was removed during the postmortem surgery.
Okay, Bruce asks, were the witnesses to the postmortem surgery ever threatened to remain silent?
Well, two of them who witnessed it when it started had to sign the orders of the gag order, the Navy gag order. That's Gerald Custer, the lead X-ray technician, and his assistant, Ed Reed. Now, Ed Reed recalled seeing the beginning of that surgery, and then I conclude they were kicked out. They were summarily kicked out of the morgue. Reed testified, suddenly they realized we're in the morgue and they kicked us out. And 15 or 20 minutes later, they called us back down. And then we did the skull x-rays. But Reed, I'm going to show you what Reed demonstrated during his deposition. He said he saw Dr. Humes take a scalpel and cut the scalp all the way across behind Kennedy's hairline, forward at the top of his head, cut his scalp all the way across, then took a circular bone saw and started cutting into the bone in this area. If you'll read chapter 13 of my book, you'll realize why I conclude that's exactly when he was kicked out. And of course, it doesn't say much for the integrity of the skull x-rays, does it? That they came down later and took the skull x-rays after all this postmortem surgery was accomplished. So they weren't physically threatened orally, but even though the gag order had been lifted, neither Custer nor Reed wanted to talk to us. The gag order had been lifted in the 70s, late 70s. They didn't want to talk to us. They had to be subpoenaed. One person who witnessed the postmortem surgery was Tom Robinson of Gawlers, and of course, nobody asked him to sign anything. So he was perfectly willing to talk about it to the House Select Committee and to us. He saw the skull sawed open. He saw it from the rear and the top and the brain removed. And he told us that's where the doctors saw the skull opens, but nobody threatened him. He was a nobody. He was a non-entity. I don't believe that James Jenkins or Paul O'Connor, the two Navy corpsmen, were in the morgue when this happened, nor was the large audience.
All right, Nicholas says, you said there were two exams of the brain, one 3 days after the autopsy and one about 2 weeks later. Was there a discrepancy in the brain weights?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mention that in my presentation. I easily could have, and perhaps I should have. The first exam was on November 25th, Monday morning. The second exam was somewhere between November 29th and December 2nd, about a week later. So Dr. Humes prepared a supplemental autopsy report, which was really a brain exam report. And we know when it was typed. It has no typewritten date on it, but the typist said she typed it about 3 days after she typed the autopsy report. So she typed the first autopsy report that was signed on Sunday. So she says she typed the brain exam report 3 days later, which would be Wednesday, which is before the second brain exam. In that report, Dr. Humes strangely says the weight of the brain examined was 1,500 grams, which is a physical impossibility for a normal brain. The maximum weight of the average male brain is about 1,380 grams. That's an average figure. You might get different figures in different textbooks, but that's the figure I got in the textbook I looked at. 1,380 grams is the average maximum weight of a male brain. Now, Dr. McClellan said that He told the Warren Commission that he thought about a third of Kennedy's brain was blown out of his head when he looked into the wound in Dallas after the president died. So that take 1/3 off of 1380 and you don't have much left. What, 900 grams or something? So how could Kennedy's brain weigh 1,500 grams? Now, the brain that was removed at the autopsy and given to James Jenkins to infuse and put in the bucket, and which was examined on Monday, the 25th, and cut up, that wasn't weighed at the autopsy. Or if it was, the weight wasn't recorded. If you look at the autopsy descriptive sheet, which you can find online, or you can find in the archives, or you can find it in my book in volume 1, there's a place for brain weight to be recorded, and that space was left blank. So my boss, Jeremy Gunn, asked Dr. Humes, did you record the brain weight? So I'm sure he knew that question was coming. It had been asked of him before. And he says, I actually don't remember. He told us in 1996, I don't remember. And he was aware, I mean, Jeremy showed him the document. The brain weight is not recorded on the autopsy descriptive sheet, not recorded at the autopsy, which would be very strange, would be abnormal procedure. So he I think, invents a brain weight out of whole cloth for this report that's typed on Wednesday, the 27th. Now, it's not dated in typewriting as the 27th. Later, he wrote a handwritten date on it of 12/6/63, but that's the date it was transmitted to higher authority. That's not the date it was typed. It was typed 3 days after Sunday on November 27th. So yeah, there's a big discrepancy. Not recorded at the autopsy in writing. Said to be 1,500 grams in the report typed on Wednesday, the 27th. And then, but the second brain hadn't been examined yet. So where did Humes get that weight? I think he pulled it out of thin air. I don't know what he was trying to do with that, but it can't be anything that he weighed with a scale.
Okay, we've got time for just one last question, and the answer can't be longer than 1 minute.
Okay.
But it's a funny question. It's an interesting question. Did the CIA control the autopsy? It sure looked like it. Well, it calls for a little speculation.
I'm willing to speculate. Many people were controlling the autopsy, but Jenkins and O'Connor, the two Navy corpsmen, spoke to the House Select Committee, both of them, and for years afterwards to anyone who would interview them, that there were men in suits telling the doctors what to do and what to conclude and what to stop doing. Stop doing that, go to the next procedure. And really angry when the doctors weren't finding what they wanted them to find. There was also Dr. Berkeley trying to limit the scope of the autopsy to the head only, and then to the upper chest only. And there were someone else in the gallery told them not to probe the throat wound, the tracheotomy site. Don't probe that wound. Dr. Fink recalled that in his testimony at the Shaw trial. So yes, there were people trying to control the autopsy, and some of them were men in suits. And Paul O'Connor and James Jenkins both thought that they had predetermined conclusions in mind, these men in suits, and that they were really intent upon the doctors finding the conclusions that they wanted. So that's all I can say about that. It's a mystery.
Great answer and great presentation, Doug. I can't thank you enough. It's been fascinating. Thank you for your time, and thanks for the great presentations.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody for paying attention and for tuning in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in, and I apologize I didn't ask everybody's question. You all know that, the ones whose questions I skipped. I tried to limit the questions. I knew our time was limited to matters relating to the presentation, but I apologize for not asking everybody's question. Next week, we continue. The thing that I would ask you all to do as we go through these 4 presentations on the medical evidence, be asking yourself the following question. Is there an innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy? With that, we'll conclude our presentation tonight. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week with Dr. Michael Chesser.